In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Several years ago, on my pilgrimage to the Holy Land, I stood outside of Pilate's headquarters in Jerusalem and felt something shift inside of me. I understood my time in the Holy Land, this pilgrimage, to be, as the Celts would say, a return to the place of my resurrection. I didn't know yet what that meant, but I knew the answer was somehow found in the tension I felt in this place, this site of accusation and condemnation, made holy and sacred over 2,000 years as a multitude of pilgrims peered down into that same perfectly carved round hole that I was, which led to the jail below where Jesus' arms had been shackled to the wall by the armed Roman soldiers. It was a truth I had not previously experienced so viscerally. I touched the iron clasps which held the prisoner's limbs. I peered up into the hole in the roof above, the only evidence that there was a world beyond this place of torture. I couldn't believe it. Violence and pain and coercion had all been wrought upon Jesus. How could this site of Jesus' torture and ultimate crucifixion, be the place of my resurrection? As I paced uneasily between the courthouse and the courtyard, which had that captivating bronze statue of the cock crowing, and Peter's horrified gaze as he became aware of his betrayal of Jesus, something loosened inside of me. My love of Jesus and its expression no longer felt constrained or needing to fit into a particular box, which I might call my priesthood or my religion or Christianity as a whole. Likewise, something tightened within me, in my chest and deep within my gut, an awareness of the knowledge that I and our world has failed to faithfully live into the gift given to us in Jesus' decision not to meet violence with violence in that moment of capture. The Jesus of John's Gospel makes it very clear that because the disciples are not of this world, they will not meet violence with violence. Jesus' teaching and Jesus' sacrificial death will break this cycle of violence begetting violence. In the end, Jesus does strip Pilate of his power, though not by the forces of this world, not by bullying or posturing or diminishing the authority of Pilate, but by relying on a force whose source is beyond this world, a force which has the power to transform, the power of God found in love. Pilate executed Jesus, but that was not the end of the story. Love was released into the world that day. Love that makes a difference in our lives this day. Love, which is the place of our resurrection. Pilate typifies a person confronted with a choice. His instincts are pulling him in one direction. He wants to release Jesus. And his peers in the world around him are drawing him in this whole other direction, wanting to crucify Jesus. And Pilate shuffles back and forth between the protection of the Roman Empire, found in the interrogation room with armed guards in heavy military boots and power ready to be released from their weapons, all of that surrounding Pilate and Jesus. And then when he goes outside, he shuffles into a concern to be of the regard of the chaotic and the volatile crowd who refuse to come within the walls of the courthouse because they don't want to risk religious defilement so close to the Passover. But it is the Jews who want the blood of this insurgent Jesus, who worry because the crowds are clamoring to be near Jesus. They want that blood to be on the hands of the Roman Empire. So Pilate is shuffling back and forth. Pilate is pacing. He's going inside and he's going outside. He's with protection and then without protection. He's with and without power and with and without clarity. And you realize this scene has to be viewed metaphorically. For it is this tension I felt within me in that exact same spot. The question of how to make right the expansive love that I felt in my heart toward Jesus in that moment, and the reality of our world, where there were indeed Israeli guards armed with machine guns posted at the entrance into the old city of Jerusalem. This tension would ultimately draw me into the place of my resurrection. And this is the very same tension that we live each one of our lives in, being drawn closer to and desirous of the source of love in which we find our resurrection. And the violence begetting violence that we see in our world. We want to somehow bring that source and power of love, that instinct to do and be what's right and good and true, and we want it to fit it into our world that so often rejects it. And this is the tension that Pilate is experiencing. It is the tension that horrified Peter knew to be true, because he had lost that battle within himself, as he allowed his desire for self-protection to overcome his desire to be loyal to Jesus. It is a tension we carry with us most of our days. Today, we celebrate Christ the King Sunday. And the language of kings and kingdoms can be both daunting and very off-putting. If kings act like Pilate did, choosing to execute Jesus against his instincts, or like the kings and czars that we remember from our history books, waging wars out of vengeance and arrogance and self-centeredness, those who have an orientation toward conquest and domination and humiliation, I don't want Christ to have anything to do with that kind of kingship. And if a king is anything like the kings in our celebrated fairy tales, who foolishly parade through the crowds naked for fear of being portrayed as incompetent or unfit for their position, as in The Emperor's New Clothes, I don't want to celebrate Christ as having anything to do with kingship. We don't need any more kings of vengeance or worldly power or violence brought upon innocent people. We don't need any more arrogant kings, fearful of being perceived as clueless. I don't want to celebrate Christ as that kind of king, a king of worldly power. The king I want for Christ to be is the one who shows up in a manger, defenseless, unarmed, and vulnerable. Jesus' own words in John's Gospel make it right for us today to call Christ a king. For in John's Gospel, Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world, which also means it's not from this world. And suddenly we realize the kingdom is about origin, not location. Kingdom is about essence, not position. Kingdom is about a state of being, not a particular action. When we speak of Christ the King, we're talking about a way of being whose origin is not of this world, not of the world of violence and control and power, but one where the source is love. And that source is beyond us and from the creator of our world. Now, just because Jesus' kingdom is not from this world, does not have its origin in our world, doesn't mean that it is not to be lived in this world. It is. That's our job. To live God's kingdom here in our world. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. It sounds a whole lot like returning to the place of our resurrection. The tension I felt standing outside Pilate's headquarters opened in me the idea that the mark of being a Christian is not so much being able to recite the creed or understanding the minutiae of our extensive doctrine built over centuries of faithful pilgrims and their experiences and their understandings of God, but rather to be able to empty ourselves of that which is not of God's kingdom. And then to succumb to the power of humility and the graciousness of love that is just waiting to fill our lives. Perhaps it is time, as the beautiful Christmas carol, O Holy Night, invites us to fall on our knees before the one who loves without caution, so that we may do the same. Because if our solutions to the world's problems come only from this world, we're in a system where violence begets violence, we're running out of solutions pretty quickly. Maybe we need to allow Jesus to lord over our hearts, to be our guiding light, to empty ourselves of whatever prevents us from really living and allowing everyone else to do that too. This may mean that we will live with an emptiness in our hearts for a time, until God's fullness sets in. It may mean that we will yearn for something that just seems impossible for a time, until God shows us a glimpse of God's reality and we know that it's right there on the horizon. We may need to acknowledge that Jesus' voice will often, perhaps always, be at odds with the prevailing messages of the kingdoms of this world. And that may make us sad or angry or discouraged or feel foolish for daring to believe. But when we empty ourselves before the Lord, when we're guided by the power based on an authority that flows from our trust in God, we can look at our culture as that which is in need of transformation by Christ, rather than one that is always at odds with Christ. And we can make that difference. Christ the King Sunday concludes this long, green, growing season of Pentecost, where we focused on the life and the ministry of Jesus, and the stories of faith just growing within people who were touched by Jesus. And this Sunday now propels us forcibly, actually, into the season of Advent, when we prepare for the birth of Jesus in our lives. So these texts of Jesus' trial might have seemed really harsh and out of place today, because our hearts are already there at that manger, celebrating the glory of the inbreaking of God into our world. But it is absolutely essential that we hold together the crucifixion of Jesus with the incarnation of God through the birth of Jesus. On a very concrete level, it reminds us that all that becomes flesh must die, even the begotten Son. But this link reveals a much bigger picture of our return to the place of our resurrection. Christ the King Sunday tells us that as we prepare for Jesus' birth, we also prepare for Jesus' death. And as we anticipate the birth of Jesus in our lives, of our new yearnings and the places of health that are coming within our own lives, to an openness of the movement of the Spirit that we've never experienced before, of the multitude of ways that we were called to create with God, we must anticipate the death of something within ourselves and our lives. When we sense the tension between doing or being that which is right, true, and good, and the pressure of those around us to do otherwise, we must let go of that fear of being perceived as incompetent or vulnerable or weak. We must let that all die. When we want to just close our eyes to the injustices in our world, we must allow that wall of self-protection to crumble. When the desire to hate or to hold on to hurt just boils up inside of us and threatens to consume us, we must allow God to release those emotions and allow love to be born again in our hearts. For we're entering into a brand new liturgical season, Advent, which is a season of preparation not just for Jesus' birth, but for our birth. And our liturgical seasons, they do follow our calendar seasons, but they are not cyclical like our months. Like January always leads into February, and our earthly seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall always follow a certain pattern, and they move predictably. And although our liturgical seasons move predictably, there is nothing predictable about them. Because with Christ being the King of our hearts, with Christ bringing the power of love into our lives, into this world, so our weary world can finally rejoice. When we fall on our knees before the power of love, it makes a difference. We are changed. When we empty ourselves, God breaks through and changes everything. This Advent will not be the same as it was last year. And it is not going to be the same as it will be next year. For Advent is about what God is doing in our lives right now, and that is always something brand new. So let us step boldly into Advent, because Advent boldly announces that God has broken through, and in that miracle we can return to the place of our resurrection, which is God's kingdom of love, which is for everyone. Amen.